This is the second interview with Bill Lacy for the Robert J. Dole Institute of Politics at the University of Kansas. I didn't mention yesterday and should today that you are the director of the Institute. And we're in the Institute's offices in Lawrence, Kansas. And today is Thursday, June 19th, and I'm Brian Williams. We're going to pick up some items from yesterday that we didn't cover, and in no particular order. Let's start with the Bosnian intervention, which became an issue in the '96 campaign.
Yeah, and I think that's it's an example of Bob Dole's style of leadership on a couple of levels. In 1995, of course, President Clinton wanted to send U.S. forces into Eastern Europe to prohibit the genocide, and he had called the senator, who was then, of course, the majority leader in the Senate, and asked him for his support. And the senator summoned a very small group of campaign advisors. I think there were 4 or 5 of us together to talk this through and everything. And so he gave us each a chance to talk. He kind of presented that the president had called him and asked him for this. He was thinking through and wanted to give the president an answer, but he wanted us to at least have a chance to have our say before he did that. And so when he got to me as the strategist in the campaign, I was prepared. I just had reams of polling data to show that the American voters were totally against this intervention, and specifically the Republican voters were even more against this intervention, and they thought it was unnecessary and uncalled for. And he listened very patiently the first time through, and then said to the group in so many ways, I think I'm going to have to support the president. And so I spoke up again, and I said, Senator, this is a bad political move. I have a tremendous admiration for the leadership that you're showing in taking that position, but it is bad politics for you and for the campaign. And at about that point, he just very politely cut me off, and he said, that's enough. He said, I've heard your argument once. You make a good argument, but I feel like I have to support the president. It's my responsibility to support the commander-in-chief. And I thought that was very telling. I thought it was telling in not only the obvious way that he clearly wanted to support Clinton, even though it was unpopular and it could potentially hurt him in his campaign. But also, I think it shows one of the things that was one of Bob Dole's qualities all along in the U.S. Senate, and even here at the Dole Institute to a large degree. He consults a lot of people. He talks to people. He really likes to hear other people's points of view, and he's a great listener. And before he went out and made that decision, he at least gave us a chance to go to court and make our case. We failed, but at least, we had the chance to do that.
Was it a unanimous decision among the 4 or 5 of you that he should not support the president?
As I remembered, it was an overwhelming opinion of the political people in the room. I think maybe there might have been a couple of when I say non-political, I mean more of his Sheila or somebody like that may have been there and may have really felt he had to support the president. But we were all making it from a political point of view, and no, I think it was pretty overwhelming that we thought it was a bad idea politically.
Do you think that part of his decision was also based upon a feeling of affinity for the Bosnian situation? Might he have, in his heart of hearts, do you think, have been supportive of the president's position, not because he was the president, but because he...
I think that's why. I think he was doing it because it was the right thing, not because it was supporting Clinton. I don't think Bob Dole would ever feel compelled to support at least a Democratic president because the president wanted it. I think he felt it was. I absolutely think he felt it was the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm. And remind me of about when that issue came up in the course of the lead up to the election?
Well, it would have been in roughly, I think, in the middle of 1995. So you're talking about several months before the first contest.
And do you feel that it in the end had some salience as a voter decision-making issue?
No, actually, I don't, because there was once Dole announced his support, it became pretty much a bipartisan issue, and I don't recall that there was a huge bitter debate over the intervention, and which ultimately shows that Senator Dole was right in his judgment.
So another issue, it was the announcement, the lead up to the announcement of the candidacy.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about that yesterday, but I find it really fascinating as I was trying to think things that we didn't cover as thoroughly as I probably should have yesterday, Brian. The senator had always kind of was notorious almost for not reading speeches before he gave them, and it was always a real struggle to convince him to rehearse or practice or something. And so, but we actually convinced him to do that with the announcement speech, and it was really interesting because he not only was convinced to actually rehearse, but I mean, he actually bought into it. It wasn't kind of like, I'm going to humor these guys by doing this a couple times. He actually called me and said the weekend before the announcement, it was actually a couple days before the weekend before the announcement, and I think the announcement was on Monday in Topeka. He called me maybe on Wednesday or Thursday and said, Elizabeth and I are going to fly down to Bal Harbor on Friday. Why don't you come down on Saturday, and we'll rehearse Saturday during the day, and then you can fly with us Sunday out to Kansas. And so I took Stuart Stevens, who is our media consultant on the campaign, and Stuart and I flew down there commercially. I think Mike Glassner picked us up at the airport, or we caught a cab in, and actually I believe we caught a cab in. And so then we were to call Mike's room when we got there, and he told us to come on up to the senator's room. And this was one of the more amazing things I saw in my life. I think I've seen Bob Dole not wearing a tie maybe, 3 or 4 times. I mean, I've always seen him in his office once. Mrs. Dole, now Senator Dole, had a birthday party for him over at the Watergate in around 87, I think. And a bunch of us went over there, and he had an open collar shirt, but that was one of the few times I'd ever seen him in an open collar shirt. So anyway, we walk into the room, and Mike greets us, and he says the senator and a bunch of his friends are out on the balcony and sitting out in the sun and talking. Why don't you come on out? So we went out, and they greeted us. And so the first thing I know is the senator is sitting there wearing shorts and Nikes and a t-shirt. And so, I mean, that in and of itself was mind-boggling. But then the cast of characters there, he had Bob Strauss, the noted Democratic Party leader, and, who's just considered one of the giants of politics, Dwayne Andreas of ADM, several other individuals who were just, you'd say they were just very powerful people, and all these guys were just sitting there dressed casually and just chewing the fat together. And, it was a whole different vision of Bob Dole than I'd ever seen before. It was very, very curious. And we eventually left, had lunch, set up the teleprompter, the camera equipment, and he came down and practiced his speech. And he actually ran through it multiple times and was really dedicated to getting it down right and to taking ownership of it, making sure the language worked for him, dropping certain words, adding a line here, a punchier line there, and really did an outstanding job on it. And then the most ironic thing happened on our stop in Ohio when we went there, which would have been, I think, the second or the third day of the tour, is after all this time that Senator Dole had practiced using the teleprompter, the damn teleprompter broke, and he had no teleprompter to use, so he had to go back to the old text. So, but it was really different, very different approach to things. It signaled to me that there was a seriousness in his intent that I had not seen in '88, and maybe it was more a matter of he was, relatively new as Republican leader in '87. He'd been elected right after the election in '86, I think, and maybe he was just, maybe the leadership piece of it was a lot easier and required less of his time at that point, but I don't know.
My guess would be that he had finally acknowledged in his own mind the need for preparation.
Yeah, he has never, in all my dealings with him, he's never struck me as the kind of guy who would do something to please you if he thought it was a waste of his time, at least in something like this. And the guy has always struck me as being so smart and so capable that I think another of the challenges that he had in terms of running for president was he didn't like to say the same things over and over again, and this notion that you go out day after day and repeat the same stupid things just drove him crazy, and I can understand that, and I appreciate that.
And when he did deliver the announcement address in Topeka, that was smooth and well done. And
yeah, it was actually very well done. Mari had some health issues leading right up to the announcement, and so she was not hands on the speech as much as I would have preferred. Near the end, I actually kind of took over and fiddled with it a little bit. Rick Smith worked on it a little bit, provided some ideas. But, Mari and Rick are both wordsmiths. I was just a political campaign strategist, and so I wasn't really qualified, but I knew Dole pretty well at that point. I'd worked with him a long time, about 20 years at that point, and so I kind of knew the way he spoke and the way he liked to do things and stuff. So it worked out well. We actually shot a campaign film that features a large piece of the speech, and so that kind of shows you that we felt he did an outstanding job delivering it because it just fit perfectly well into that film that we did.
Do you have any observations on his response to the State of the Union address in January '96?
Yeah, that was the one, I think, if memory serves me correctly, Brian, where he didn't look all that great and was not perceived by the national media as being very strong or anything. I think that was probably a function, going back to what we talked about some yesterday. In both those campaigns, you had a guy who was dealing with two jobs that would kill any normal one person. He was the Republican leader in the Senate, and he was running a presidential campaign. And, we may very well see a Republican or a Democratic party leader succeed and be nominated president at some point in the future, but it is a real challenge because those are two very demanding roles. And I thought I'm sure it was an extraordinarily difficult decision for him when he chose to leave the Senate, and an extraordinarily painful decision for him. But I thought that sign showed to me when he did that in summer of '96 that he truly was committed to this race, and that in his own way he was basically saying, no turning back, second place isn't good enough.
This is probably a good point for you to talk about Richard Ben Kramer's book, What It Takes.
Yeah, Richard wrote that book during the build-up to the '88 campaign, and it really is, from my point of view, and when it came out, I said and I read it, and if you look at the organization of the book, what he did is he covered, I believe, 6 of the presidential candidates, 3 on each side, and for whatever reasons, and if Richard Ben were here, and I've actually talked to him about it, but this is for him to say, not me, but for whatever reasons, he seemed to get inside Bob Dole's head more than anybody that's ever written about Senator Dole. And so what it takes is about 6 candidates, but when it came out, when I read through it the first time, I just read the Dole sections because he really skillfully, instead of kind of just laying it all out, he divided it into sections, and so each section featured one of the 6 candidates that he was writing about. And he got Senator Dole's speech patterns down precisely, kind of the Midwestern speech style that Dole had. He got a grasp of how Dole thought about things, how he approached things. He had really complete access to the campaign, and the campaign worked with him. Campaign enjoyed working with him, and it really is it is a definitive book in 2 ways, in my view. It's definitive in its treatment of Bob Dole. Somebody will come around and write a full-scale biography of Bob Dole someday. That will be outstanding as well, but that was far and away the best treatment of Bob Dole that has been done to date, even though it was only a relatively brief portrait and not as in-depth as you would do a full-scale biography. But it's also definitive in another way. I just think it's the best book ever written on American politics and presidential candidate character. It is, I mean, he covers, Bush, and I forget the other Republican, and Senator Biden, and I believe Governor Dukakis on the Democratic side, and one other, and it's astounding. And I tell everybody the first book you ought to read about Bob Dole is What It Takes.
Did you observe him at work during that campaign? Oh
yeah, he interviewed me like you're interviewing me right now. He would come in and we would talk and trade phone calls from time to time. He had a great researcher on it, Mark Zonwitzer, who's gone on to do some incredible stuff on his own and his own right. And Richard Ben was just fabulous.
Was there, I guess there wasn't any chronicler of that caliber on the 96 campaign, is that correct?
Well, I think Bob Woodward did a masterful job with the choice, but what Richard did is Richard really reached into the character. That was his goal, and what Bob tries to do is he tries to basically write history where no history could be written, because he has to go and get the access and everything. And so Bob is unique in his approach to things, because what he does is he talks to so many people that he kind of tries to reconstruct the events, and he did an unbelievable job on that book. I think those 2 books are really, and of course I'm biased because I've read them both and helped the authors with both of them, but I feel that they are really far better than the run-of-the-mill campaign books. I think they're 2 of the best ever done.
I noticed that Woodward uses a technique of really expansive quotes of people, and you were quoted among lots of others. Were his quotes accurate, generally speaking?
Generally speaking, they were outstanding, and he would tape the interviews so that they had the backup on everything. And it took me a while to be able to talk to Bob the way that he wanted me to talk about things, because I was still relatively young at 95, and I had never granted anybody access, but we had agreed pretty much as a campaign, and the senator was totally on board on giving him pretty much full access. And so that's what we did. And I remember starting out, Bob really, I never felt he pushed me to do anything that wasn't absolutely the truth or the way I saw it at the time. I don't think he ever tried to get me to reconstruct things. What he tried to do is he would say, well, now tell me some of your language, kind of what was your thought process? And he would really dig deep on stuff so he could go back and recreate it. So when you say, did his quote seem right? I don't know, because I can't remember sometimes if I talk to so many people, I can't remember sometimes what I said about a subject yesterday, but is it believable that I said that? Yeah, I think that by and large, with everything that I saw in that book, I would believe that the people saying it actually said that, or said something that was 1 or 2 words different, but in terms of content and meaning were identical.
Do you have any notion why he didn't continue that book right to the November final?
You know, he told me at the time, and I honestly am not sure. I believe, if memory serves me correctly, Brien, what he wanted to do is he wanted that book to be not a history of the nominating process, but a window into the campaigns. And timing on his books, as you've noticed, is really important. And, you know, Bob writes very high-quality stuff, but it's commercial stuff as well. And I think it was probably a timing issue. And, you know, Richard's book, I mean, if it had come out during the campaign, or even if he had written the book prior to these men actually jumping into the race, it could have had a huge impact, because, I mean, the way that he treats Bob Dole just lifts him to a whole different level.
Talking about candidates in context and whatnot, you've had the advantage of a trip, or maybe more than one, to Russell, Kansas, which I'm sorry I haven't been able to do myself.
Yeah, well, we should have required you to go to Russell and do some interviews as part of this, but since we limited the scope more to Senator Dole's Senate years, there's a reason for that. I've only been to Russell twice, actually, but to both announcements. That's when I was in Russell, and it's an intriguing small town. I'm from a small town in Tennessee, and there's similarities, but there's great differences all. But what always struck me about Russell is just being incredible. And people who come here to the Dole Institute and who go around and find out about, you know, they look at the Russell window, which is a stained glass window that depicts Main Street Russell about the time the senator was growing up, and they hear the story about the cigar box that the town sent around to collect money for Senator Dole's operations, and near the end of the exhibits, they get to go inside one of the local establishments in Russell for a Visa commercial, I think it is. The thing that really astounded me in those two visits was the folks' warmth and support of Bob Dole. I mean, it was like you know, Mick Jagger or Keith Richards returning to home and just being mobbed and everything, and just enormous energy and enthusiasm. It was all out of this little tiny town, so it was really very special.
The Bob Dole that you know, would you say that he's become over the years a kind of combination of Washington savvy and culture and still the hardscrabble Midwestern?
I would put it differently. I would say, generally speaking, yes, but I would put it differently. I think who he's become is really simply an extension of, you know, of what he was brought up to be in his life, his experiences in the war. You know, in terms of looking at, you know, character and political figures, I'm a firm believer that their past speaks very loudly about what they'll do and what they're capable of doing in the future. And I think that the war experience was very hard on Bob Dole, but it clearly shaped him as a person. And you know, we had in here the other day our Dole scholars, and he actually said in his comments by phone to the Dole scholars that he was very disdainful of his classes at school when he started at KU, and he said he was making horrible grades, and then he went off to war, and he came back a different man because of his devastating injuries. And it occurred to him one day during his recovery that he couldn't make his living in his life anymore with his body the same way that other individuals could, that he had to do it with his mind. And from that time forward, when he re-enrolled at Washburn University, he received all A's except one from then forward, after having an abysmal record before that. That's a pretty telling point I thought he made just the other day.
Let's move then. This is a good way to move on to the Dole Institute and how it came to be and what your thoughts are and aspirations for it.
Yeah, well, I know you're doing an interview of Rick, or you've done one of Rick, so I think how it came to be I would leave in his very capable hands. What I'm really, the way I look at it now, I'm kind of charged with, at least for as long as I'm here, with Bob Dole's legacy, and I kind of see this as the place where we will maintain, a tribute to Bob Dole in perpetuity. And he really wanted, this is very important to the senator, and Rick probably talked about this in his remarks, but Bob Dole really wanted this place not to be a library and a monument to him. He really wanted it to be more about the people of today's generations, and he wants it to be a place that is alive and that's breathing and is active and that encourages people to get involved and to take bigger roles. And that's kind of what we focused on here. We have a bipartisan mission. We have lots of Republicans, lots of Democrats. We try to maintain a philosophical balance, and generally speaking, I think do a fairly good job of that. But what we're really trying to do is reach out, especially to students, but really not just students, but the community, all Americans, and really people across the world who tune into our website at various times to watch our programs that we video and make available to everybody. Just encourage them to be more involved in their communities, to be more involved in their politics, to look at politics differently than they might, maybe a little less negative light, to be a little bit more civil and courteous in their treatment of, controversial issues. I think people really are getting tired of what you see on cable TV now. It's kind of 24/7 yelling and screaming and interrupting people, and it's the best soundbite wins rather than the most rational, well thought out, reasoned argument wins. And we just want to try to be a little bit of a positive influence in that respect.
What's your take on the citizenship commitment of Kansans? Is voter participation fairly high here?
Voter participation is okay here. I don't know that it's dramatically better than it is in other states. I think that generally speaking, my experience, and I'm from the South, as I think you know, but my experience in the Midwest is that people are probably more community minded than they are in other parts of the country. They're probably a little bit more public service minded than in some other parts of the country that I've been in. But I don't know that you can measure that empirically or objectively. I will say that the programs that we do here that are oriented towards service and civic engagement are extraordinarily well received. As you know, we had the Dole Scholars Program. The recipients of the scholars and family members were in here on Tuesday for lunch. We had 150 people. We just started the year after I got here a Civic Youth Leadership Institute. I was thinking one day, well, geez, you have basketball camps, you have football camps, why couldn't you have a leadership camp? And so we started 2 years ago with the idea of having 50 high school juniors, meaning they would be seniors next year, come learn about the Dole Institute, get lectures from authorities on different, political leadership issues, go visit the Capitol with our associate director, who's a state representative, and generally just kind of get their feet in the water a year early on what the college lifestyle is like, because they actually stay on campus. They stay in dorm rooms for 2 nights, and it's really quite an experience for them, and they don't have to pay a penny to do this. It's something we fund completely. So for 2 years, we had about 50 or 60 applicants, and we accepted everyone, but it's starting to get around now. So this year we had over 100 applicants, so we had to reject over half of our applicants this year because we like to keep class size to 50. But that kind of effort, while you're only reaching 50 high school juniors a year, you do that year after year after year, and if you did that in every state, and if you did that at every university, there would be huge changes in this country.
Mm-hmm. Are you aware of other state universities that are doing similar programs?
There are a number of political institutes around the country, not a lot, but a number of them that are connected to state schools that do similar programs. I don't know about leadership camps for high school students or stuff, but I know that Senator Baker has in the works a wonderful institute at the University of Tennessee. I know that the Lyndon Johnson School at the University of Texas is outstanding, but we're less about education and more, about enriching the educational experience and providing outside opportunities for students and others.
What do you think Dole's legacy will be over time?
I think a lot of people will remember him as, as a party leader, as a presidential candidate, as the party nominee in '96. But I really think his legacy is going to be, as we've discussed in the past, his leadership in the United States Senate. It is clear to me that it's factually correct that he's the longest-running Republican leader in history. That speaks volumes right there about his the immense admiration that his colleagues and respect his colleagues had for him. And I've always thought that, the best thing you can ever do in life is to have your colleagues at a very, very high level select you as, the first among equals. That to me is profound, very profound. But it goes beyond that. They just genuinely liked the guy. They knew he was fair. The Democrats liked him and got along with him great. Ted Kennedy liked him, and Tom Harkin, and George McGovern and Senator Dole worked on a lot of stuff together, and so there's that nice piece of bipartisanship there as well. But really, I think it's his leadership in the Senate, it's his style, it's the way that he treated people all equally, all fairly, and it was really, I think that's what he'll be known for.
Over the course of his career, the culture in the Senate has changed quite a bit. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, one of the reasons the Dole Institute was created, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, or one of our missions, I should say, is to really promote civility and courtesy. And there's a lot of acrimony in Washington, D.C. now. The members don't appear to get along. They don't appear to like each other. In many cases, they don't even appear to know each other. It's almost as if they don't sit down and talk about issues, which in fact is really closer to truth than I would care to admit sometime, because when people see them on TV and all, many people may not be aware that the Senate chamber or the House chamber is empty when somebody's giving a speech, and a lot of it is for show and not go. And that's because of a huge variety of factors, and frankly, it's not all that different from our society as a whole. I mean, society where you have, such levels of coarseness in our culture, you have road rage incidents, you have all of that stuff going on. Politics kind of reflects that, and I don't think politics is responsible for it. I think it's something, deeper based. But one thing that we try to emphasize is you can talk about controversial issues, and you can do so in a rational way, and you can do so in a courteous way. We want to promote the notion that it's okay for Americans to disagree, and in fact that it's better for Americans who disagree to sit down and talk about those differences and better understand the other person's point of view, even if it doesn't change yours, but to better understand that person's point of view. So instead of taking the view that I am right and you are wrong, take the view more or less that there's a couple of ways to skin the cat, and I've got enough votes this time, so we're going to skin the cat my way.
I think it was Richard Ben Kramer who talked about what he called the intoxication and the hyper-existence of campaigns. He used those terms. And you've been in that place. What has it been like for you? What does it feel like?
Well, I mean, first of all, campaigns used to run a matter of a few months, even a presidential race. I believe, if I remember correctly, Brien, Senator Dole announced his 88 campaign in November of '87. Now, we actually went to work in about March or April of that year, kind of as an exploratory committee. So we were running, but everybody knew that it was official by November, I think it was. And in the '96 race, we actually had a campaign set up by January. And I remember that very vividly because I'd just come off Fred Thompson's first Senate race, and I was really kind of tired, and I said to everybody really felt that we had to get up and running. I said, I think we can wait a couple months. We're not going to lose anything in a couple months. But they strongly disagreed, and I said to Joanne, I said, I got to have some time off. She said, you just go, do whatever you want to do, come back, at the end of January, mid-February, whenever it was, and we'll take care of all that. So they actually, by the time I got back, they were actually starting to, put together the basics of the campaign, the basic operations, and then Scott Reed had been there a few days before I got back, or maybe a week before I got back, and then he brought in people to kind of set up the infrastructure, and we moved to a bigger office and everything. But just that just is amazing. And then people ask me about my recent experience running Fred Thompson's campaign. Fred asked me to go into it last August when he was in a pretty difficult situation. He had a lot of support, but he had no campaign. And we had 5 months before the first contest when I got there, and pulling together a presidential campaign in 5 months is just sheer impossibility in today's age for a couple of reasons. One, it's just too much to do in a short period of time. By contrast, when Fred ran for U.S. Senate the first time, we started his campaign in the late summer of '93, so we had like 15 months to put together a U.S. Senate race, and a presidential race is not like 50 U.S. Senate races. It's far more exponential than that. But the other piece of it too is that because you're now in prime time, a year out from a presidential campaign, the media isn't absorbing everything you say and looking at it through all kinds of different prisms and everything. But by the time Fred was in the race, they were at that level. And of course, all the other candidates had been out there honing their lines, honing their sound bites for literally a year and more at that point. And so Richard Ben Kramer is right. It's gotten a little bit crazy now. I wish we could do something about that in our country. People are going to get fed up with the 24/7 year-round campaign sooner or later.
But as a campaign strategist, what, for you personally, is the allure of getting involved in these campaigns?
Well, there is no more allure now. I can tell you definitively that. I would not have done Fred's campaign if I did not feel two specific things. Number one, I admire him a lot. I like him a lot. I thought he would be a great president. And two, he clearly was the genuine conservative in the Rockefeller, in the Reagan Goldwater mode in the race. And I really felt an obligation to help him. I would have never gotten involved in another campaign, and I have no intentions to do so again. But what got me involved when I was younger is there is just, it really is a way to make a difference. And but at some point you get too old for it, and you try to make a difference in another way. And I feel that the difference I make here with students at the Dole Institute every day is just, in many ways, just as important.
You described your growing political awareness yesterday, pretty much starting with Goldwater.
That's correct.
And how do you see the Republican Party's movement through time since Goldwater, 64, and so forth? What's been the path, do you think, of the party?
Well, I think I can chart it pretty much. I think Goldwater kind of set the philosophical base of the modern party. I thought that Richard Nixon was not a conservative president by any means, and history will continue to go back and forth on Nixon, his brilliance in foreign affairs versus, some of his failings and character flaws. But you have to give, in your question, you have to give Nixon a certain amount of credit, because Nixon really figured out politically, along with his team, how a Republican Party could grow and emerge. And then Kevin Phillips wrote what I always thought was an incredible book, The Emerging Republican Majority, that was published, I believe, maybe 2 years after Nixon was elected, and basically outlined how the Republican Party was going to be the majority party at some point in the future. And people literally laughed at that book when it came out. But then the real defining moment came I think more in 1976 when Ronald Reagan challenged Gerald Ford and ultimately lost the nomination, actually a few miles down the road in Kansas City at the convention. But I think basically he lost that nomination, but he won the heart and the soul of the Republican Party with that campaign. And I think that was the beginning point of a fundamental shift in the party, where basically once Reagan was actually elected president in '80, and served as president for 8 years, and now is historically regarded as being one of the best presidents of the last century, and making a lot of historians' top 5 lists for best president ever. I think that what that did is that really changed the whole tone and tenor, and then Newt Gingrich came along and figured out that the way you won a congressional election was that you tried to turn back Tip O'Neill's old philosophy of all politics are local, which I still believe them to be, and I think Speaker Gingrich would say he still believed in that concept, but he figured out a way to use a little bit of strategy to get people to vote not maybe their guy as much as our guys. And he had a lot of help from Bill Clinton, and he had a lot of help from Bob Dole in a positive way in electing Republicans in the Senate in '94. And at that point, as far as I'm concerned, in '95, I had been in Washington, D.C., and by 1994 for 17 or 18 years, and here in a relatively small part of my adult life, we had gone from being a joke in Congress to having control of both branches. And unfortunately, all of that is unraveled in the last 8 years, and it's been awfully hard to watch and very difficult, and the world has changed a lot, and part of the issue, frankly, is that Ronald Reagan was instrumental in bringing about an end to the Cold War, and the Cold War had always been an issue that had been on the front burner, and less in the 60s but more in the 80s had been a point of difference between the two parties, and so the Republican Party kind of lost one leg of its coalition there, and that's one thing I've observed. The other thing that I've observed and talked to a lot of my friends about is the quality of candidates on both sides of the aisle seem not anywhere as good as they used to be, in terms of the level of experience, in terms of the level of life experience separated from political experience. And our party, it bothers me that our party, I don't see yet the quality of the individuals who are going to come forward to run for president in the future. I know there's a bunch of them down there, but we really need to move on to the next generation and figure out what we're going to do as a party.
You had a slip of the tongue a few minutes ago in even mentioning Rockefeller Republicans.
Yes.
Where do you see that branch of the party, which for many years was quite powerful and has not been so? Where does that go?
Well, I think that's a fair question. I think, my phrase that I used for a long time was in the post-Reagan world, Republicans are all conservatives. There were liberals in Congress really through the Reagan years, but I tell you, after Reagan left the White House, the number of liberal or moderate Republicans just started to precipitously decline. Part of that, I think, was due to Reagan's influence on the party. Reagan clearly steered the party in a different direction, and so that meant maybe there were some liberals who no longer identified with the party. But in so steering the party in that direction, there were huge chunks of geography, political geography around the country that Reagan finally got to switch and coalesce and to consider voting Republican. And ultimately, it was kind of Reagan's coalition that I think elected the '94 Congress, but it had a little bit of help, like I say, from Gingrich, Dole, Clinton, and their various roles and all. And I think that kind of accounts for a lot.
Right.
I think in terms of the Rockefeller, I don't see a Rockefeller, and when I say that I mean a more liberal or moderate influence in the party, and I don't necessarily see it coming back. We've seen a number of prominent Republicans switch parties here in Kansas, and my attitude has been, if you truly believe in what the National Democratic Party stands for, that's fine, you should switch. If you truly believe what the Republican Party stands for nationally, that's fine, you shouldn't switch. But some of it's done for political expediency, but some of it's done for very legitimate reasons, and it's clear and it's actually better for our politics, I think, that you have one party that's perceived as being conservative and one liberal. I think what's happened, though, is our party has kind of lost its way, and we've got to go back and figure out who we are and what we believe.
Of course, a Democrat would have said the same thing a few years ago, so I guess this keeps happening.
Yeah, well, there's two kinds of presidencies. There's the kind of presidency that rallies a party and motivates it and creates a foundation to build on, and then there's a kind of presidency that fails to do that for whatever reason. And what happens next is that we've been through a period where Americans are not happy as a group with the way things are being done right now. And they're going to get a chance to switch, and the question is, do they go with John McCain or do they go with Barack Obama? If they go with John McCain, he's going to have a chance to change that tone. If they go with Senator Obama, he'll have a chance to change that tone. But generally speaking, unfortunately, and this is very sad, but generally speaking, most presidencies in contemporary history turn out to be perceived as not particularly good by voters, and there's some notable exceptions to that, and there's some disagreement to that, but generally speaking, there's nothing wrong with one political party that the other political party can't fix by going into power. So we'll see what happens this November.
Right. Good. Should we leave it there?
That'd be great. Thank you.